With that, I will pass things over to our colleagues at WIDA, where they'll present some findings from their research.
Thank you, David. Very informative. I think there is a lot of parallels between your study and our study with some important differences. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here today with us in this late Tuesday afternoon. I'd like to thank our colleagues from IES-REL and from American Institutes for Research for this opportunity to collaborate and participate in this webinar alongside this esteemed panel and to share some of our research with you. My name is Narek Sahakyan. I'm a researcher at WIDA, housed at Wisconsin Center for Educational Research at UW-Madison. My work at WIDA throughout the last decade has been at the intersection of educational policy, statistics, examining large-scale student assessment data with a focus on multilingual learners. Glenn is my co-presenter and a research partner in crime. He's a graduate student and a graduate assistant at WIDA and a dissertator at UW-Madison Education Leadership and Policy Analysis Department. And he gets a lot of kudos for his work helping put all these data together in a very busy and short time for him. Here's an overview on your screen on what we'll be discussing today. We'll share some information about the WIDA Consortium and our students, some motivation behind the study, and some of the literature that has started unpacking this important issue. We'll review some findings from a recent WIDA report on the impact of COVID-19, updating it with most recent student assessment data from 2023, which we just finalized at WIDA, and talk a little bit more about the research that lies ahead. Next slide, please. This is the WIDA Consortium, a little more about where Glenn and I work and do our research. The WIDA Consortium, housed at the UW-Madison and Wisconsin Center for Educational Research, is made up of 41 states, territories, and federal agencies. In addition to providing the access test, a large-scale, high-stakes annual language assessment used in many U.S. states, WIDA is dedicated to the research, design, and implementation of a high-quality, culturally and linguistically appropriate system to support multilingual learners in K-12 contexts. Today, we will be presenting some of this research that examines the impact of COVID-19 on English learner outcomes. But before we move forward with the motivation and literature behind this study, I just wanted to make it a little more explicit that we will be using the terms multilingual learners and English learners somewhat interchangeably throughout this presentation to emphasize the rooted nature of these student categories in federal legislation and terminology. Further, the outcomes that we're discussing today are assessed for the entire population of students who are officially identified as English learners in districts and schools across the WIDA Consortium states. There is a large body of literature that discusses how labels like limited English proficient, English learner, long-term English learner are limited and deficit-based. They are restrictive, they can have a detrimental impact on students in direct and indirect ways. We welcome alternative framing of these student categories, such as emergent bilinguals reflected in the Texas legislation, or multilingual learners that highlight the assets that these students bring to American classrooms. However, it is also important to acknowledge that fixing the labels alone will not resolve the multitude of systemic challenges that permeate these young learners' education and may even distract from urgent issues. All right, with all of that said, next slide, please. Just a little bit motivation literature, as if we won't need any more to study this important topic. Basically, disruptions in language supports, reduced opportunities to practice language skills with peers and teachers, online penalty and digital divide for vulnerable learners, stressed and under-resourced families are but some of the ways that COVID-19 induced disruptions to education have likely had a detrimental, cumulative, and long-lasting impact on these students' educational and career trajectories. Next slide, please. With these concerns in mind, quantifying the impact of the pandemic on our students' proficiency and language growth trajectories has been at the top of WIDA's research priorities since the early days of the pandemic. In the last couple of years, As more and more data became available, we've published 2 reports, the second one on your screen right now, and the third one now in the making, to describe and compare ELLs proficiency and growth before and after the pandemic. In these reports, we presented aggregated trends in both the average and by domain proficiency and annual growth for ELLs taking the Access Online assessment, comparing these outcomes in the pre-pandemic academic years of 18-19 and 19-20 to the post-pandemic academic years 2021 and 21-22. Glenn will help us revisit some of the main findings in a bit, giving us a preview of the data from the most recent 22-23 academic school year. But for more details and nuance that we can't possibly cover within the short time available today, you can use the QR code or the link to check out some more nuances and details, and also keep an eye out for the third COVID report that should be coming out early next year. I do want to note the fortunate timing of this again, in that we have just finalized our annual collection and merging of the test score data that we get from WIDA states for the 2023 administration, meaning that the 2023 results that we'll share today, that we will preview today, should be pretty close, if not identical, to the ones that will be published in the upcoming COVID report. In this and other impact of COVID-19 reports, the outcome variable that we're interested in are English learners' proficiency as measured by their access scale scores, and growth as measured by the annual gains that English learners make in scale scores in both the overall composite and in the individual language domains. I'll let Glenn talk a little more about overall composite scale scores before we turn to examining student outcomes and findings. Glenn?
Thank you, Narek. As he mentioned, we're focused in the study on composite scale scores, which combine scores from each of 4 domains: reading, writing, speaking, and listening. Those scores are vertically scaled, which allows us to compare student growth from year to year. And each score corresponds to a grade-specific proficiency level, which is what many states use in reclassification decisions. Those thresholds vary, though, as do other important contextual factors like policies around EL identification, what resources and supports they have available, etc. So as we look at the overall trends, it's important to keep in mind that large heterogeneity across contexts. With that said, we'll start by looking at average proficiency over the last 5 years. So next slide, please. The colored bars in this figure reflect average composite scale scores in each year since 2019, broken out into 4 different grade level clusters: early elementary, late elementary, middle school, and high school. This is the same figure from our last report, but we did add in dark green on the right-hand side of each cluster the 2023 results. So the size of the tested population in each year is shown in the upper right-hand corner. Overall, the EL population across the WIDA Consortium increased each year, with the exception of 2021, which we've highlighted in red. We estimate that about 30% of English learners were missing in 2021, not at random, likely due to pandemic-related disruptions. So the middle bar in light green for each cluster reflects average scores from that more limited sample. But then in 2022, testing resumed, and we saw a persistent decline across all grade clusters in average composite scale scores since the start of the pandemic. And with the 2023 data most recently finalized, as Narek mentioned, that trend has continued. So drilling down into domain-specific trends, the scores in reading seem to have been the most resilient to those overall declines in proficiency since the beginning of the pandemic. English learners in middle schools and high schools demonstrated about the same average scores in each year. These are overall trends, of course, for the entire consortium, so they might not be representative for any given state or district or school. But on average, we saw scores remain fairly steady in reading, apart from a dip in the early elementary grades and late elementary grades, where scores in 2022 and in 2023 have remained lower than pre-pandemic averages. Scores in writing, on the other hand, have shown a large and continued decline since 2019 for all grade level clusters. And the trend seems to have finally slowed down or perhaps stopped for early elementary and also high school ELs in 2023. But overall, we've seen a persistent decline across the board since the start of the pandemic. student scores in listening, in speaking, showed small declines for early elementary students as well as middle and high school students, but maybe bounced back a bit overall for late elementary students. Scores in that cluster dropped a bit in 2021, which was the year that we saw a drastic reduction in testing rates. But the averages for 2022 and 2023 align with the averages from 2019 and 2020. Meanwhile, in listening, there was also a fairly consistent decline in scores, especially for elementary school students. There was a downward trend for late elementary students as well, while older students actually went up a bit in 2021. But again, that could be attributable to the selected nature of the sample in that year, because scores since then have declined for middle school and high school students. These are, so moving on to the next slide, overall, composite proficiency scores have declined since the pandemic started, and those decreases have continued into 2023. Students are scoring lower in basically all domains and all grade level clusters, and we've seen the largest declines in the earlier grades. Of course, these are population level averages for access scores in each year, so they're just snapshots of overall student performance, not necessarily how individual students were affected by the COVID pandemic. And disentangling the relationship between proficiency and growth can be pretty tricky, but we'll also take a look at some of the growth trends over the last 5 years. Overall, on the next slide, please, growth rates dropped in the first year of the pandemic, academic year 2020 to 2021, especially for younger students in elementary grades, which is where most growth happens on typically for students. Since then, though, growth rates have bounced back and even topped pre-pandemic levels, especially for those elementary grades. But we should keep in mind that growth is relative to proficiency. So some of those increases might be related to lower initial proficiency levels in the underlying population as students enter EL status across the consortium. We also have those broken down into the 4 domains. And there's some nuances based on which grade level clusters we're looking at, but we're not going to dig into those details right now. We're happy to answer questions if anyone has any, but the main takeaway is that growth dipped significantly in 2021, but then picked back up and has even exceeded pre-pandemic levels in more recent years, especially for those early elementary school students. Again, there's tremendous regional and demographic variation within the EL population, both between and within the 40 states and territories, 41 states and territories. And we're only looking at the averages in this study. Narek has started to drill down into some of the nuances within those patterns. So I'll pass it back to him to talk about some of the work we've been doing to explore those patterns in more detail.
Thank you, Glenn. Unfortunately, the aggregate grades in EL outcomes and the 2023 assessment data suggest that overall we're still on the decline, and it may still be a little too early to talk about a bounce back or recovery, at least with respect to average student proficiency and growth. However, we've only looked at average proficiency results, grouping students across grades or grade level clusters, regardless of any other differentiating factors. Yet we know that English learners are a very diverse and heterogeneous subgroup with many unique and distinguishing circumstances, and in WIDA states specifically dispersed across very different geographies. Therefore, it is natural to expect that the COVID-19 pandemic has affected these students' proficiency in different ways. Next slide, please. To evaluate the differential impact of the pandemic on EL's proficiency, we turn to more powerful tools, namely regression analyses. I'd like to just give you a quick preview of some forthcoming research. Using more specifically, we apply an interrupted time series research design using the COVID-19 pandemic as a natural experiment and leverage the entire access longitudinal data set, which spans over 8 years of English learner outcomes and tens of millions of student records. We use multi-level regression models accounting for students nesting across states, districts, and schools, and a rich set of individual level covariates to estimate the impacts of the pandemic on EL proficiency across many intersectional English learner subgroups. Without going into too much details of our methods and models, I would like to just very quickly preview some preliminary results that you're seeing on your screen from this ongoing research. So for example, the preliminary results from the model suggest that the average impact of the pandemic for Hispanic English learners was estimated at about -13 scale score points compared to that of about -7 scale score points for non-Hispanic English learners. Considering that average EL growth at the individual level is about 25 scale score points on aggregate, and this is of course very different by grade level, cluster, and proficiency level. This is roughly equivalent to about half a years of academic instruction of learning for Hispanic ELs and about a quarter for non-Hispanic learners. Similarly, the pandemic has had a negative impact on the average proficiency of ELs identified as Native American or Pacific Islander or Native Hawaiian. On the other hand, Asian, white, and Black English learners' average proficiency has increased after the pandemic. Next slide, please. So why is it that we are seeing some of these continued learning losses and declines in average proficiency and growth, of course, excluding some student subgroups? The reasons, of course, are multifaceted and complex, but the one thing that jumped out for me as I was reviewing some of the recent news and articles on the topic is this headline calling out the crisis that has evolved into a catastrophe, and how this article written just a couple of months ago starts, that Vance Varner is heading into another school year desperately searching for teachers and staff members, an English instructor, a special ed teacher, a speech therapist. Indeed, 3 years after the pandemic forced the closure of schools, many districts and schools are still struggling to find much needed resources to provide a quality education for our most vulnerable and marginalized learners. While my desk research is perhaps far removed from the classroom level, in my daily work at WIDA, working with state educational agencies providing technical assistance, I can say that I witnessed the same phenomenon at that high level as well, at the SEA level too. Next slide, please. And despite all the concerning trends in EL outcomes that we've reviewed today, I do want to finish with a bit of positive news that there is perhaps some relief inside. The federal government has had a swift response to this unprecedented disruption to the educational system and has allocated an unprecedented amount of aid to counter this. The ESSER funds, next slide, please, that total about $200 billion have been allocated for countering the anticipated heavy learning losses brought about by the pandemic. Further, states must disperse at least 90% of this funding to prioritize low-income students, and all the funding must be spent by 2024. While districts and schools are figuring out effective ways to disperse all this funding, I will be eagerly waiting for the 2024 access data, hoping that to finally see a reflection of some of these allocations and funding via more positive outcomes and upward trends in English learners assessment data. I will stop here and turn it over to Lisa. You can see our email addresses on your screen. If there are any questions or any comments, we'd be happy to get them over email, and now, of course, at the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Narek and Glenn. It's so interesting to hear these results and to see how they look similar in some ways and different in some ways to the Texas ones. I do see in the chat we have one question that has remained unanswered, and so I'll quickly walk us through that one, and then we'll shift into the panel discussion. So Min O asks, regarding the growth trends, is there some type of expected or average range of scale score growth at each grade level? Because Narek, you had briefly referred to 20-ish points as equivalent to half a year of growth. So they are curious if there's guiding material on making sense of the scale score increase or decrease.
It's a really good question, and I wish I had a better answer rather than that it is very context specific. we have 41 different states, territories, and federal agencies. And the demographic population of English learners is vastly different from some places compared to others. Of course, we can average out across the entire consortium and the entire grade span to come up with one number, like I mentioned for reference, that negative or that 25 scale score growth across years. But to call that expected growth, I really don't want to do that. It is really, really different by grade level, by starting proficiency level, by state, because states have different identification and reclassification criteria that end up affecting at the aggregate, how these outcomes are manifested at the ground level. So I'll just say that it is very context specific, and it really depends on what set of kids we're looking at. I'm happy to unpack this further, but I hope that answered your question. And I know there was another question regarding the sample. So that Min is correct. This is only access online, which doesn't include kindergarteners. We have started looking at the kindergarten or the paper test that includes the kindergarten grade, and the results aren't overly different. The patterns that we're seeing in the online test pretty much hold up and maybe are even a little worse, given that we're looking at the worse in terms of the impact of the pandemic, because we're looking at our youngest learners who perhaps have had less opportunities to make use of some of the remote learning and other things brought about by the pandemic. I'll stop there.
Thank you. There was one other question too from Rachel asking when people can expect the results from this updated study to be made public.
I'm gonna say early next year. So let's say February. We have a lot of work ahead of us trying to, let's say early next year.
Thank you.